Sometimes the world will try to tell you what you're worth before you've even had a chance to discover it for yourself. Sometimes you walk into a room and they look at you, not for who you are, but for who you aren't. And it hurts. It hurts when your existence feels like something you have to apologize for. It hurts when you're laughed at before you even speak. But let me tell you something. I've lived that. I've walked down the hallway where every eye turns not with welcome, but with whispers. I've felt the sting of cruel words hurled like knives, all because I didn't fit someone else's definition of beauty, strength, or normal. But if you have a heart, I ask you, look deeper. She didn't get to pick the body she'd be born into. She didn't vote for the stairs in the hallway, the whispers that cracked louder than thunder, or the silence that wrapped around her like chains. But life didn't wait for her permission. It handed her a storm before she had learned how to stand, and then dared her to find her way through it. And she did. Not because it was easy, not because someone handed her a map, but because deep down in the quiet corners of her heart, there was a fire that refused to go out. She wasn't given a choice, but she chose power. She chose power. She chose to rise up in shoes she had to build with her own bruises. She chose to use the eyes that judged her as fuel for her vision. She chose to carry her pain, not as a burden, but as a balance. And maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there right now. Maybe you've been given the kind of life you didn't plan for. Maybe the mirror shows you things the world taught you to hate. Maybe you've cried behind closed doors asking why you couldn't just be a normal. But here's what she would say to you. Normal doesn't shake the world. And power doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for someone who's willing to turn the impossible into proof. She was broken before she bloomed, but that bloom, it's unforgettable. It's the kind that leaves petals in people's memory long after they forget her name. You don't need to be handed a choice to make one. You just need to decide, like she did, that the pain will not have the final word. The first time they laughed, she decided not to disappear. They laughed like she was a joke that walked into the room. It wasn't just the words, it was the looks, the shifting eyes, the subtle nudges, the cruel confidence of people who had never been made to feel small. For a moment, she wanted to disappear, to hide under the table of expectations and hope no one noticed. But then something happened. As the laughter echoed, a voice rose louder inside her spirit, not shouting, but solid, still unwavering. You are not the problem. That moment didn't change her features, but it shifted her fight. She decided not to be invisible. So, because the world needs more people who refuse to let cruelty redesign their worth, the moment you choose not to disappear is the moment power begins. She wore every insult like a badge of resistance, and she didn't wait for the world to become kinder. She became stronger. She showed up the next day, chin up, heart exposed, arms open. She made herself seen on purpose, and in doing so, she gave others permission to show up too. Perfectly. Not without fear, but powerfully present. She didn't wait for applause. She clapped for herself in a world addicted to validation. She didn't wait for it. She made her joy a quiet revolution. There were no cheering crowds when she learned to speak up. No cameras when she wiped her own tears. No awards for surviving nights she couldn't even describe, but every time she looked in the mirror and whispered, "I'm still here," heaven stood and clapped. She didn't post it. She lived it. She made milestones out of moments others would overlook, because greatness isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it looks like taking one more step with nobody watching. Sometimes it sounds like silence, but feels like a soul roaring. She clapped for herself when no one noticed, when no one cared, when no one thought her steps were worth celebrating. She became her own cheerleader in a world that told her to sit down. And one by one, others started rising because she gave them an example of what it means to clap, even when the music isn't playing. Her victory was never about the crowd. It was about the courage. They called her too much. So she became more too loud. Too different, too opinionated, too unpretty. They tried to shrink her, to fold her voice into the corners of acceptability, to reduce her brilliance so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. But she decided she would not become less just so they could feel more. She grew, she expanded, she became more. She grew, she expanded, she became more. More honest, more visible, more present, more powerful. When they called her too much, she realized that their limitations had nothing to do with her capacity. She wasn't too much. She was just enough to shake the mold. She was the kind of woman who made people rethink their definitions. She was the kind of person who showed the world that difference doesn't mean damage. It means destiny. And you are not too much either. Your voice matters, even if it trembles. Your passion matters, even if it's misunderstood. Don't let their smallness shrink your spirit, become more. Speak louder, take up space. Let them adjust their lens instead of dimming your light. She didn't beg to belong. She became the place others belong. She got tired of knocking on doors that didn't open, tired of shrinking to fit into circles she was never meant to stand in. So she stopped begging and started building. She became the space, the safe place, the arms that opened when others were shut out. Because she knew what it felt like to be excluded. She knew the ache of being the outsider. Instead of becoming bitter, she became better. She became better. Yay. She created a world where belonging wasn't bought, but born from kindness. She didn't build it with approval. She built it with heart, with late night talks and early morning tears, with gentle words and fierce truth. She became a home for those still wandering, and in that, she found herself too. Her strength wasn't in being accepted. It was in accepting others without making them perform for it. She rewrote the rules. She built the table. And then she pulled out a chair for every soul that had ever been told they weren't enough. That's how power moves. Not by force. Not by force. But by love that won't fold. By compassion that knows what pain feels like and still chooses to heal. So yes, she was born different. She was born into a world that didn't make space for her kind of beauty, her kind of brilliance, her kind of boldness. But she chose power, not because she had to. And not because she had to, but because something deep inside her knew. This story will help someone else write theirs. She didn't wear her pain like a polished story. It wasn't packaged, it wasn't perfect, and it didn't come with a silver lining tied in a bow. It was raw. It was raw. It was real. It was real. It was the kind of pain that left her breathless at night, with only a pillow to soak up the questions no one else heard. But she never faked her healing. She never rushed to pretend she was okay, just so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. She sat with her ache, looked it in the eye, and told it, "You don't define me." Her story wasn't one of flawless victory. It was one of unfiltered truth. Of showing up broken and still believing something beautiful could rise out of the mess. And because the truth is, honesty is a form of power. When you stop hiding your hurt, you stop letting it hold you hostage. And that's what she did. She stood up, not because the pain disappeared, but because her courage to face it grew stronger than her fear of being seen in it. Her healing didn't come in the spotlight. Her healing didn't come in the spotlight. It came in the dark and the tears and the honesty. Her pain was never pretty, but it was the beginning of her freedom. They pointed. They whispered. They laughed when they thought she couldn't hear. But she heard. And for a while, it stung like a wound that couldn't close. They weren't just mocking her appearance. They were mocking her spirit, her existence, as if she didn't belong in the space she dared to walk into. But what they didn't know was that every time they laughed, they were lighting a fire inside her that would one day burn through the very limitations they tried to put on her. She didn't fight them with anger. She didn't answer back with venom. She rose with purpose. Whoa. She laughed too, but her laugh wasn't shallow. It came from a place of strength they could never reach. It echoed with the sound of defiance, of resilience, of a soul that had decided to rise no matter how heavy the weight of judgment felt. Her laugh wasn't a cover. It was a declaration that she would not only survive, she would shine. That no voice of mockery could compete with the voice of someone who's found purpose. So yes, the world laughed, but she laughed louder because her laugh wasn't for them. It was for the little girl inside her who finally knew she was enough. She never asked to be born into a world that judged so quickly. She never auditioned to carry the weight of what others feared or didn't understand. But she was given life, and with it, the silent expectation that she either hide or apologize for how different she was. And different she was. For years, she tried to shrink herself, thinking maybe if she was small enough, quiet enough, the world would stop noticing. But the world kept staring, kept labeling, kept assuming, and somewhere deep inside her spirit, something finally whispered that you don't have to become what they see. You get to become who you are. That whisper was small, but it was sacred. It was a voice no one else could hear, but it carried a volume that would one day change lives. So she stopped hiding, not because it was easy, but because pretending was harder. She began walking through the very crowds that used to make her cower. She showed up to rooms that weren't designed with her in mind. She spoke when her voice shook. She smiled when the shame tried to creep in. And in doing so, her life became more than just a life, it became a message. A message not just to the world that had underestimated her, but to those still trying to find their own way through the fog. She didn't set out to be brave. She set out to be brave. She set out to be real, and in a world obsessed with perfection, that choice made her unforgettable. She knew what it felt like to be invisible while standing in full view. She knew how loneliness could feel louder than any crowd. But she also knew how a single act of courage could become a compass for someone else who felt lost. Every time she stood up after being knocked down, she wasn't just rising for herself. She was rising for the quiet ones who hadn't yet found their voice. The ones who cried in bathrooms. The ones who cried in bathrooms. The ones who feared mirrors. The ones who felt like they were always one step behind what the world expected. She became a living letter to them. Her scars were ink. Her smile was a signature. And her every step forward, no matter how shaky, spelled out the truth. You're not alone. You matter alone. You matter. And your story's not over. They called her broken. They were wrong. She was breaking barriers. They called her fragile, but strength doesn't always shout. It sometimes shows up in the softest, most persistent ways. The world praised beauty wrapped in filters and symmetry, but she brought a different kind of beauty. One that couldn't be seen unless your soul was awake enough to feel it. She proved that a heart fully alive is more powerful than any face perfectly aligned. Her life wasn't made of highlight reels or applause. It was built in silence. In moments where giving up seemed easier. In nights when no one clapped, but she still chose to keep going. That's where the message was written, not in her success, but in her surrender to something greater, her truth. She didn't need the world to validate her steps because she had finally learned to walk in alignment with something deeper than approval, purpose. She never tried to become someone else's version of strong. She became the kind of strong that can sit with sorrow and still choose hope. The kind that doesn't flinch when misunderstood. The kind that doesn't need to fight every battle, but instead chooses which ones are worth bleeding for. Her strength wasn't loud, but it was steady. It didn't demand attention, but it could not be ignored. She didn't fill rooms with her presence. She filled hearts with her resilience. She showed that authenticity isn't a style, it's survival, that there's power in vulnerability, and that no matter how deep the wound, healing is possible when you stop trying to hide it and start honoring it. Her tears had chapters, her laughter had history, and her silence sometimes carried more wisdom than words ever could. People began to notice, not because she begged to be seen, but because her life began to speak louder than any introduction. Young girls who once hated the way they looked began to hold their heads higher. People who once saw their pain as punishment started to see it as preparation. Her life taught them to stop running from their reflection and start running toward their redemption. She became a living mirror, reflecting back the truth so many had forgotten. That being different isn't a curse. It's a calling. That your battle scars don't disqualify you from purpose. They are the very evidence of it. Her joy wasn't naive. It was rebellious. It was forged in fire. And it gave permission to others to stop waiting to be rescued and start realizing they were the hero they'd been searching for all along. She didn't rise to be worshipped. She rose to remind others how to rise. to rise. She wasn't interested in becoming someone's inspiration if it meant being put on a pedestal. She wanted to stay human, to stay reachable, because the message she carried wasn't about her. It was about us, about the ones still standing in the shadows, wondering if they'll ever feel like enough. The ones whose voices tremble when they speak, whose hands shake when they write, whose hearts break quietly in public. She rose to say, there is life beyond the labels. There is love beyond the rejection. And there is purpose even in the pain. She knew not everyone would understand her path. But she walked it anyway, because she wasn't living for agreement. She was living for alignment. Alignment with the truth of who you are, even in your rawest form, is exactly who the world needs. She didn't need to be fixed. She needed to be heard. She needed to be heard. And once she allowed herself to speak, she became a voice for thousands who couldn't. Her life wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was powerful. Because it reminded every soul it touched that sometimes the most beautiful lives are born from the most broken places. That your story matters, even if no one has clapped for it yet. So yes, her life became a message, not through fame, through flawless speeches, but through daily decisions to keep going when it hurt, to keep believing when it didn't make sense, to keep showing up when no one asked her to. She was never trying to prove anything. She was simply choosing not to disappear. And in doing so, she lit a torch in the darkness that so many others began to follow. Her light didn't blind, it guided. And her message wasn't just heard, it was felt. Not everyone will know her name. But they'll remember the way she made them feel less alone, more seen, deeply understood. And that, in the end, is what makes a life truly meaningful. Not how loudly it shouts, but how deeply it reaches. She didn't become a hero by accident. She became one by choosing every single day to turn her pain into purpose, and her life into a message that will echo long after the world stops watching. There's a kind of pain that doesn't show up in bruises. It lives behind the eyes, in the silence after laughter fades, in the loneliness that clings even in crowded rooms. That was her kind of pain, and while others tried to hide theirs behind masks and filters, she didn't pretend. She allowed herself to feel it, to grieve what could have been, to cry when it was too much. But here's the miracle. She didn't stay there. She let her tears teach her. She turned her sorrow into depth, her ache into empathy. She became someone who could sit with another suffering and say, I see you. I've been there. And that's why her story touches the heart, not because it's flawless, but because it's real. And real pain, when shared with courage, becomes a bridge that helps others walk through their own darkness. She didn't glamorize the struggle, she honored it. And through it, she found her voice, not to complain, but to comfort. And that voice, it has the power to break chains, but when life doesn't give you options, when the world places you in a box with no door, you have two paths, surrender or build your own exit. She wasn't given a choice in the way people stared at her, judged her, labeled her without knowing the depth of her soul. But where others saw limitations, she discovered invitation, a quiet invitation to become the strongest version of herself. And that strength didn't come from outside approval. It came from the sacred fire within her that refused to die. Every time she was told she couldn't, she whispered back, watch me. And then she did it, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to herself that their words weren't the truth. Her story isn't one of blame or bitterness. It's a story of reclaiming power, not with fists, but with grace, because real power isn't loud. It's consistent. It's the decision to smile anyway, to speak anyway, to show up anyway. And that kind of strength that touches hearts without needing to shout. There's nothing more rebellious than joy in a world that expects you to be broken. They laughed at her, not the kind of laugh that lifts a room, but the kind that aims to shatter self-worth. They pointed, they joked, they made her into a spectacle. But she didn't crumble. She didn't become what they projected. Instead, she gathered every cruel word like broken pieces of glass and turned them into mosaic light. She laughed, not because she wasn't hurt, but because she refused to let pain define her. She smiled in defiance of every stereotype. Stereotype. Joy became her rebellion. And joy like that, it's electric. It doesn't just protect the soul, it empowers it. And anyone who witnessed it felt something shift inside themselves. Because when you watch someone celebrate their own spirit after it's been trampled on, you begin to believe maybe you can too. Maybe joy isn't earned. Maybe it's claimed. Maybe it's a birthright no insult can revoke. Her laughter wasn't noise. It was a message. You don't own my worth. I do. I do. Not everyone will understand your journey, especially when it doesn't look like theirs. But when you live your truth out loud, you become a lighthouse for others who are lost in the fog of self-doubt. That's what her life became. A message for every little girl who looked in the mirror and saw only flaws. For every teenager bullied into silence. For every adult who still carries scars from words spoken decades ago. She didn't wait for a platform. She became one. For a platform, she became one. She didn't wait for someone to hand her a mic. She was a message. Her existence became evidence that you don't have to be perfect to be powerful. That you're different isn't a curse. It's your crown. It's your crown. And when you wear it with dignity, something sacred happens. Other people start to see their beauty too. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just being honest. And in doing that, she gave others the permission to do the same. Her life told the world, I'm still here. I still matter. I still matter. And so do you.